Marcus Cole stepped out of the black SUV, his designer sunglasses reflecting the morning sun as it cast long shadows across the marble pathways. The famous pop star had sold over 50 million albums worldwide, and his face was recognized in every corner of the globe. Today, however, he was just another visitor to Arlington National Cemetery, though his expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair made him stand out among the other tourists. His manager, Rebecca, walked beside him, constantly checking her phone and muttering about schedule changes. "Remember, Marcus, this is just a quick photo opportunity for the charity campaign. 15 minutes, maybe 20 at most. We have the interview with Rolling Stone at noon." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't really listening. He had agreed to this visit as part of his image rehabilitation, after a series of controversial statements he had made during his last tour. His publicist thought it would be good for him to be seen paying respects at the nation's most sacred military cemetery. The photos would show his patriotic side, she had explained, and help repair his reputation with older fans. As they walked through the cemetery grounds, Marcus couldn't help but feel slightly uncomfortable. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps on gravel and the occasional whisper from other visitors. Row after row of white headstones stretched out before them, each marking the resting place of someone who had served their country. It was more overwhelming than he had expected. The autumn air was crisp, and Marcus pulled his expensive jacket tighter around him. He had grown up in privilege, the son of wealthy parents who had supported his musical dreams from the beginning. Military service, sacrifice, and loss were concepts he understood only from movies and songs. The reality of this place felt foreign to him. "There it is," Rebecca said, pointing ahead to a simple white building with columns. "The tomb of the unknown soldier. This is where we need to get the photos." As they approached the memorial, Marcus noticed how other visitors lowered their voices to whispers. A small crowd had gathered to watch the changing of the guard ceremony, which his research team had told him happened every hour during the day. He checked his expensive watch. They had arrived just in time. The tomb itself was elegant in its simplicity. A white marble sarcophagus sat atop a raised platform, with steps leading up to it. Carved into the stone were the words, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." In front of the tomb, a soldier in a crisp blue uniform walked back and forth in a precise pattern, his movements sharp and deliberate. Marcus watched the guard for a moment, noting how the soldier's face remained completely expressionless. His eyes focused straight ahead. The guard took exactly 21 steps in each direction, then paused for 21 seconds before turning to walk back. Each movement was performed with military precision as if it were a sacred dance. "He's been doing that all day?" Marcus asked Rebecca, speaking louder than the other visitors around them. "Shh." An elderly woman nearby turned to glare at him. "Show some respect." Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and annoyance. He wasn't used to being told what to do by strangers, especially elderly women in tourist clothes. His fame had insulated him from such direct criticism for years. He lowered his voice, but his mood had already shifted. The ceremony continued, and Marcus found himself growing impatient. The guard's movements were hypnotic but repetitive, and he couldn't understand why people seemed so mesmerized by it. He had important things to do, interviews to give, music to record. Standing here watching a soldier walk back and forth felt like a waste of his valuable time. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he pulled it out to check. His new song had just hit #1 on the charts, and his social media team was asking for his reaction. For a moment, he forgot where he was and felt the familiar rush of success and validation that came with each new achievement. "Mr. Cole," Rebecca whispered, "the photographer is here. Are you ready?" Marcus looked around and spotted the photographer setting up his equipment at a respectful distance. Other visitors continued to watch the ceremony, their faces showing various degrees of solemnity and respect. A few families were clearly military relatives, identified by their confident familiarity with the protocol and their quiet, dignified bearing. As the photographer began taking pictures, Marcus tried to look appropriately serious and respectful. He had perfected this expression for award shows and charity events, a look that conveyed depth and sincerity, without appearing too sad or too happy. The camera clicked away as he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing toward the tomb. But as the minutes passed, Marcus found his attention wandering. He noticed how the guard never seemed to acknowledge the crowd, never smiled or made eye contact with anyone. The soldier's dedication was impressive, he supposed, but it also seemed a bit theatrical. After all, who were they really guarding? The unknown soldiers had been dead for decades. The whole thing struck him as an elaborate performance, not unlike his own concerts, but without the energy and excitement that made performances worthwhile. At least when he performed, people cheered and sang along. Here, everyone just stood around looking serious and sad. As these thoughts ran through his mind, Marcus began to feel more disconnected from the ceremony rather than more connected to it. The weight of the place that had initially impressed him now felt oppressive and artificial. He was ready to leave, ready to return to his world of music and success and adoring fans who appreciated his talent. The changing of the guard ceremony began, and Marcus watched with growing fascination at the precise choreography unfolding before him. A relief guard approached from the quarters beneath the amphitheater, his movements just as sharp and controlled as the guard already on duty. The crowd around Marcus grew larger, with more visitors gathering to witness the ritual that happened every hour throughout the day. Marcus observed how the relief guard carried his rifle at exactly the same angle, how his steps matched the same 21 count, how even his breathing seemed controlled and measured. Every aspect of the ceremony was rehearsed to perfection, from the inspection of the rifle to the formal changing of positions. It was like watching a military ballet, beautiful in its precision but somehow emotionally distant. "This happens every single day?" Marcus whispered to Rebecca, who was busy coordinating with the photographer for better angles. "Every day, all year round," she replied without looking up from her phone. "Even in storms, snow, hurricanes. These guys never take a break." Marcus found this information both impressive and puzzling. The dedication was undeniable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for show. The unknown soldiers weren't going anywhere, and they certainly weren't going to notice if their guard took a day off. It seemed like an enormous amount of effort for what was essentially a symbolic gesture. As the ceremony continued, Marcus noticed the expressions on the faces around him. Some visitors had tears in their eyes, others stood with military posture themselves, clearly veterans or family members of service personnel. An older man in a worn baseball cap with military insignia wiped his eyes as he watched the guard's methodical pace. A young mother nearby lifted her small son so he could see better, whispering explanations about honor and sacrifice. The boy listened with wide eyes, trying to understand concepts that were still beyond his years. Marcus found himself wondering if his own parents had ever brought him to places like this when he was young. He couldn't remember any such visits. The formal inspection began, with the relief guard examining every inch of the weapon with white gloves, checking the rifle's condition as if it were about to be used in actual combat. The precision was remarkable, but Marcus began to see it differently than the other visitors. To him, it looked like an expensive piece of theater, performed for tourists who wanted to feel connected to something meaningful. His phone buzzed again with notifications about his latest album sales, streaming numbers, and upcoming appearances on talk shows. The real world, his world, was continuing to move at breakneck speed while he stood here watching soldiers play dress-up with rifles and white gloves. The contrast felt jarring. The ceremony concluded with the new guard taking his position, beginning the same 21-step pattern that his predecessor had been performing. The crowd began to disperse, some lingering to take photos from the permitted areas, others moving on to visit other memorials throughout the cemetery. Marcus noticed that the older man in the military cap remained standing at attention long after others had left, his eyes fixed on the guard with an expression of deep respect and understanding. Whatever this ceremony meant to him, it was clearly more than just a tourist attraction. Marcus felt a momentary pang of something, not quite guilt, but a recognition that his experience was fundamentally different from that man's. "Did you get enough shots?" Marcus asked the photographer, eager to move on to the next part of his schedule. "Just a few more," the photographer replied, adjusting his lens. "Maybe you could move closer to the barrier, show more of the tomb in the background." As Marcus repositioned himself, he became more aware of the guard currently on duty. The soldier was young, probably no older than Marcus himself, with a clean-shaven face and eyes that never seemed to focus on anything specific. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button polished to a mirror shine. Marcus found himself studying the guard's face, looking for some sign of personality or individual thought behind the military composure. But the young man's expression remained completely neutral, as if he had trained himself to become a living statue. It was impressive in its way, but it also struck Marcus as somewhat robotic. The photographer finished his work and Rebecca began gathering her things, clearly ready to move on to their next appointment. But Marcus found himself reluctant to leave just yet. Something about the scene held his attention, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. 5 more minutes, he told Rebecca, who sighed but nodded. Marcus watched as a group of school children approached with their teacher, who began explaining the significance of the memorial in hushed tones. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, some clearly more interested in the soldier's rifle than in the historical significance of the site. One little girl raised her hand and asked why the soldier never smiled. Her teacher explained that the guard was showing respect for the fallen soldiers, that smiling wouldn't be appropriate in such a sacred place. The girl nodded solemnly, trying to understand. Marcus found the interaction touching but also slightly amusing. The idea that someone could maintain such serious composure for hours at a time seemed almost superhuman to him. In his world, authenticity meant showing emotion, connecting with audiences, letting personality shine through performances. This kind of rigid control seemed to go against everything he believed about human expression. As he continued to watch, Marcus began to feel a growing sense of disconnect, not just from the ceremony but from the entire environment. The reverence that seemed to come so naturally to other visitors felt forced and artificial to him. He respected the soldiers who had died in service to their country, certainly, but this elaborate ritual felt like something from another era. His success had taught him the value of innovation, of breaking rules and challenging expectations. The music industry rewarded artists who could capture attention, who could stand out from the crowd and make people feel something new and exciting. This ceremony seemed to be about the exact opposite, maintaining tradition, following rules that had been established decades ago, performing the same movements day after day without variation or creativity. As the minutes passed, Marcus became increasingly restless. The guard continued his methodical pacing, 21 steps in each direction, the pause, the turn, and then the same pattern repeated. Marcus began counting along in his head, finding the rhythm predictable and somehow monotonous. It reminded him of a metronome, keeping time for a song that never changed. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his agent in Los Angeles. Marcus glanced at Rebecca, who shook her head firmly. Taking a phone call here would definitely not look good in the photos, and it would probably offend the other visitors who were maintaining the hushed atmosphere of respect. But the call reminder made Marcus think about all the opportunities he might be missing while standing here. His latest single was climbing the charts, and there were radio interviews to give, social media posts to make, and strategic decisions to discuss about his upcoming tour. Every minute spent in silence felt like a minute of momentum lost. He watched as another group of tourists approached, their guide explaining the history of the tomb in reverent whispers. The guide spoke about the unknown soldiers from World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, about how their identities would forever remain a mystery, but their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Marcus listened with half his attention, but found himself more focused on the guard's unwavering routine. The young soldier showed no sign of fatigue, no indication that he was even aware of the growing crowd around him. His face remained a mask of professional composure, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The sight began to strike Marcus as almost comical. Here was a person so committed to a performance that he had essentially become a human robot, programmed to repeat the same actions without deviation or personality. In Marcus's world, such rigidity would be considered a failure of artistic expression. A family nearby was trying to take a selfie, but kept getting frustrated because they couldn't get the guard in the background without violating the posted rules about photography. Marcus watched their increasingly desperate attempts to capture the perfect shot, and he felt a growing sense of the absurdity of the entire situation. Everyone was performing for everyone else, he realized. The guard was performing his duty, the tourists were performing their respect, the families were performing their patriotism for their social media followers. Even he was performing his rehabilitation for the cameras. It was performances all the way down. How much longer? Marcus asked Rebecca, making no effort to keep his voice particularly low. Shh. came the familiar response from several nearby visitors. This time, Marcus felt a flash of genuine irritation. He was Marcus Cole, one of the most successful recording artists of his generation. He had performed for presidents and royalty, had won every major music award, and had fans in every country on earth. Being shushed by random tourists felt like an insult. The guard continued his pacing, seemingly oblivious to Marcus's growing frustration. The soldier's dedication was admirable, Marcus supposed, but it also seemed like a tremendous waste of talent and energy. This young man could probably be doing something productive with his life instead of walking back and forth in front of a tomb all day. Marcus began to imagine what it would be like to break the silence, to interrupt the ceremony with something unexpected. In his concerts, the best moments often came from spontaneity, from connecting with the audience in ways that couldn't be planned or rehearsed. This place seemed to actively discourage any kind of authentic human interaction. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled up to the barrier, his caregiver pushing him to a spot where he could see the ceremony clearly. The old man's eyes were fixed on the guard with an intensity that spoke of deep personal connection to what was happening. Marcus noticed how the veteran's hands trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion. He couldn't tell. The sight of the veteran should have moved Marcus to greater appreciation for the ceremony, but instead it reinforced his sense that this was all about living in the past. The world had moved on from the wars these soldiers had fought in. Technology had changed everything about how conflicts were waged, and yet, here people were, still performing rituals from a different era. Marcus thought about his own grandfather, who had served in Vietnam but never talked about it. The old man had always seemed uncomfortable with military ceremonies and parades, preferring to keep his service experience private. Maybe he had understood something that these tourists didn't, that real sacrifice didn't need elaborate displays to be meaningful. The guard completed another circuit, his movements as precise as they had been an hour ago. Marcus found himself wondering if the soldier ever got bored, if he ever wanted to just stop and have a normal conversation with someone, if he ever felt the urge to break out of the rigid pattern and do something spontaneous. Rebecca tapped her watch meaningfully, reminding Marcus that they needed to leave soon for his next appointment. The Rolling Stone interview was important for his career, and the journalist was flying in from New York specifically to meet with him. Keeping high-profile media waiting was not good for business relationships. 2 more minutes, Marcus said, though he wasn't sure why he wanted to stay longer. Something about the scene continued to fascinate him, like watching a piece of performance art that he couldn't quite understand. As he stood there, Marcus became aware of how different his presence was from everyone else's. Other visitors seemed genuinely moved by what they were witnessing, but he felt like an outsider looking in on a ritual that held no personal meaning for him. The disconnect was becoming more pronounced rather than less so. The autumn sun had climbed higher in the sky, and Marcus could feel sweat starting to form under his expensive jacket. The guard, meanwhile, showed no sign of being affected by the temperature, his uniform still crisp and his posture still perfect. The contrast between their comfort levels struck Marcus as somehow symbolic of their different relationships to this place and its meaning. Marcus checked his phone one more time, noting that they were now running behind schedule. His impatience was growing by the minute, and the solemn atmosphere that had initially impressed him now felt oppressive and stifling. He wanted to leave, to return to his world of music and excitement, but Rebecca was still coordinating some final details with the photographer. As he waited, Marcus noticed a small crowd gathering for the next changing of the guard ceremony. More tourists arrived, cameras ready, children asking questions in loud whispers. The guard continued his precise routine, completely unaffected by the growing attention. A group of teenagers on what appeared to be a school trip approached the memorial. Marcus watched as they struggled to maintain the serious demeanor their teacher had obviously instructed them to adopt. One boy kept fidgeting with his phone, clearly wanting to record video but not daring to break the rules. A girl near the back rolled her eyes when her friend whispered something in her ear. Marcus found their barely contained restlessness relatable. Like him, they seemed to be going through the motions of respect without feeling genuinely connected to what they were witnessing. The whole thing felt like elaborate theater designed to make people feel emotions they might not naturally experience. The guard turned at the end of his measured walk, executing the precise movement that Marcus had now seen repeated dozens of times. As the soldier began his return journey, Marcus found himself wondering what would happen if someone just started talking to him. Would he break character? Would he ignore the interruption? Would security intervene? Must be the most boring job in the military, Marcus muttered to Rebecca, not bothering to lower his voice as much as he probably should have. Rebecca shot him a warning look, but Marcus was already committed to the thought. The guard was young, probably not much older than some of Marcus's fans. What had led him to choose this assignment? Was it considered an honor, or was it just another duty rotation that someone had to fulfill? An elderly woman standing near Marcus turned to give him a disapproving stare. She wore a small pin on her jacket that identified her as a military mother, someone who had clearly lost a son or daughter in service. Her expression made Marcus feel momentarily ashamed of his casual attitude. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by a surge of defiance. He hadn't asked to be judged by strangers, and he certainly hadn't done anything wrong by questioning the efficiency of military ceremonial duties. If anything, his tax dollars probably helped pay for this elaborate show. The relief guard began approaching for the next changing ceremony, and Marcus watched the familiar ritual begin to unfold again. The same precise movements, the same careful inspection of equipment, the same transfer of responsibility from one silent guardian to another. How many times do you think he practices that routine? Marcus asked Rebecca, speaking just loud enough that several nearby visitors could hear him. Marcus, Rebecca warned quietly. Maybe we should— I'm serious, Marcus continued, his voice carrying more than it should in the hushed environment. I mean, it's impressive and all, but you've got to wonder if there isn't something more productive these guys could be doing with their time. The military mother turned around completely now, her face showing a mixture of shock and anger. Other visitors began to notice the disturbance, their respectful attention shifting from the ceremony to the source of the inappropriate commentary. Marcus felt the weight of their disapproval, but instead of backing down, he felt compelled to explain himself. In his world, honest questions and unconventional thinking were valued. Why should this place be any different? Look, he said, addressing the growing circle of attention around him. I respect what these soldiers represent, obviously, but walking back and forth in front of a tomb all day, there's got to be a more efficient way to honor the dead. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several veterans in the crowd stiffened visibly, their faces showing the kind of controlled anger that comes from military training. The mother with the pin took a step closer to Marcus, her hands trembling with emotion. Efficient? She repeated, her voice tight with controlled fury. This isn't about efficiency, you ignorant— Ma'am! Rebecca intervened quickly, stepping between Marcus and the increasingly hostile crowd. I apologize for any— No, Marcus said, waving Rebecca aside. He was committed now, his performer's instincts taking over. I'm genuinely curious. How is this different from any other kind of performance? I mean, the guard can't actually protect anyone by walking around like that. It's purely symbolic, right? The question seemed to electrify the crowd in the worst possible way. Marcus realized that he had crossed some invisible line, but his pride prevented him from backing down. In his experience, controversy often led to deeper conversations and better understanding. But this crowd wasn't looking for deeper conversation. A veteran using a cane stepped forward, his face red with anger. Son, you clearly don't understand what you're looking at here. Then explain it to me, Marcus replied, his tone becoming more challenging. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like expensive theater designed to make tourists feel patriotic. The words came out harsher than he had intended, but Marcus found himself unable to stop. The combination of frustration, impatience, and wounded pride had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. The guard, meanwhile, continued his routine as if nothing was happening. His training had obviously prepared him for distractions, and he showed no sign of having heard any of the commotion developing just feet away from his post. This only reinforced Marcus's point, in his mind. If the ceremony was truly sacred and meaningful, wouldn't the guard at least acknowledge that something disruptive was happening? The soldiers' complete indifference seemed to prove that this was all just mechanical routine. Maybe, Marcus said, his voice now carrying clearly across the entire area, maybe the unknown soldier would appreciate it more if his guard actually seemed like a real person instead of a wind-up toy. The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus knew he had gone too far. The silence that followed was different from the respectful quiet that had pervaded the memorial before. This was the silence of shock, of collective outrage, of boundaries crossed that could never be uncrossed. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Marcus stood frozen, suddenly aware that every pair of eyes in the vicinity was focused on him, with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, poisoning the sacred atmosphere he had so carelessly disrupted. Rebecca grabbed his arm, her grip tight with panic. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered urgently, but Marcus found himself unable to move. Something in the faces around him had finally broken through his defensive arrogance, and he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The military mother with the pin stepped forward, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "My son," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "My son died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. He was 22 years old." She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. "He used to write to me about the honor guards at the tombs of his fallen brothers. He said it meant everything to know that someone was watching over them." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The woman's pain was so raw, so immediate, that it cut through all his intellectual arguments and clever observations. This wasn't about efficiency or symbolism for her. This was about her child, about love that continued even after death. "Ma'am, Marcus began, but she held up her hand. "He wanted to be a guard here someday," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite her tears. "He said it was the highest honor a soldier could achieve, to stand watch over brothers who could never come home." An older veteran stepped beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder in support. "That guard you called a wind-up toy," he said to Marcus, his voice heavy with controlled anger. "That young man volunteered for this duty. He goes through months of training, learns every detail of military history, and practices those movements until they become perfect, because perfection is what our fallen heroes deserve." Marcus felt heat rising in his face, but it wasn't anger anymore. It was shame, deep and burning. Around him, other visitors began sharing their own connections to the memorial. A woman spoke about her grandfather who never came home from World War II. A young man talked about his brother who died in Iraq, whose body was never recovered. Each story hit Marcus like a physical blow. These weren't just tourists performing patriotism for social media. These were people connected by grief, by loss, by love that transcended death. And he had walked into their sacred space and made jokes about the rituals that helped them cope with unimaginable pain. The guard continued his measured pace, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding nearby. But now Marcus saw something different in that steady rhythm. It wasn't mechanical or robotic. It was a promise kept hour after hour, day after day, a promise that the fallen would not be forgotten, that someone would always be watching over them. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the words felt inadequate, meaningless in the face of what he had just learned. The military mother looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. "Are you?" she asked simply. "Are you really sorry, or are you just sorry you got caught being cruel?" The question hit Marcus harder than any criticism he had ever received in his career. All his life he had been praised for his honesty, his willingness to say what others wouldn't. But honesty without compassion, he was beginning to realize, was just another form of cruelty. Rebecca tugged at his arm again, clearly desperate to extract him from the situation before it got worse. But Marcus couldn't leave, not yet. Not like this. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," he said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "He never talked about it, but my grandmother told me he used to have nightmares. She said he would wake up calling out names of friends who didn't make it home." The crowd around him remained skeptical, waiting to see if this was genuine reflection or just another performance. Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier. "He died when I was 15 and I never really understood what his service meant. I guess I thought military stuff was just old-fashioned, something from a different time that didn't matter anymore." The military mother's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained watchful. "What was his name?" "Robert Cole, Bobby to his friends. He was a medic. Medic saved my son's life twice before." She paused, unable to finish the sentence. "Before the third time when there wasn't anyone close enough to help." Marcus felt something breaking open inside his chest, a wall he hadn't even known he had built around his own family's military connection. He had spent so many years focused on his own success, his own achievements, that he had never stopped to think about the sacrifices that had made his comfortable life possible. The guard completed another circuit, his movements as precise as ever. But now Marcus could see the humanity in those controlled gestures. This wasn't a performance for tourists. This was a sacred duty, performed with the kind of dedication that Marcus had only ever brought to his music. "The guard," Marcus said, looking back at the military mother. "How long does each one serve here?" "Usually about a year," replied the older veteran. "But the training never stops. They study every detail of military history. They maintain physical standards that most people couldn't meet. And they do it all knowing that most people will never understand what they're really doing here." Marcus thought about his own training regimen, the hours he spent perfecting his performances, the dedication required to maintain his voice and stage presence. But that was for applause, for fame, for personal glory. These soldiers trained with the same intensity for something much harder to achieve, the chance to serve something greater than themselves. A new changing of the guard ceremony was beginning, and Marcus watched with different eyes as the relief guard approached. Now he could see the weight of responsibility in the soldiers' bearing, the pride that came not from being seen but from serving. The precision wasn't robotic, it was reverential. The crowd around Marcus had grown quieter, but he could feel their continued attention. His words had opened a wound in this sacred space, and simply apologizing wouldn't be enough to heal it. He needed to do something more, something that showed he truly understood what he had disrupted. As the changing of the guard ceremony continued, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by a mix of emotions he hadn't expected. The precision of the movements, which had seemed monotonous before, now appeared sacred. Each step represented a promise kept, each turn a vow renewed. The young guard's dedication wasn't performance art, it was love made visible. The military mother stood nearby, still watching Marcus with a mixture of pain and hope. Her earlier tears had dried, but the grief in her eyes remained fresh, as if her loss had happened yesterday rather than 3 years ago. Marcus realized that for her it probably felt like yesterday every single day. "Mrs. Marcus began, then stopped, realizing he didn't know her name. "Patricia Williams," she said quietly, "and my son was Staff Sergeant David Williams." "Mrs. Williams," Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't used to showing in public. "I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. But I also want you to know that your son's memory is going to change how I see everything." Rebecca shifted nervously beside him, clearly worried about where this conversation was heading. They were already late for the Rolling Stone interview, and every minute they spent here was potentially damaging to Marcus's carefully managed schedule. But for the first time in years, Marcus didn't care about the schedule. The ceremony concluded with the new guard taking his position, beginning the same 21-step pattern that had been performed countless times before and would be performed countless times again. The relieved guard marched away with the same precision, his duty complete but his commitment continuing. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus noticed that many people were still watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. His casual cruelty had wounded this sacred space, and everyone seemed to understand that leaving now would be another act of disrespect. Marcus thought about his grandfather again, about the nightmares his grandmother had described, about the names Bobby Cole had called out in his sleep. For the first time, Marcus wondered about those names, about the friends his grandfather had lost, about the guilt he must have carried for surviving when others didn't. "Mrs. Williams," Marcus said suddenly, "would you tell me about David? What was he like?" The question seemed to surprise her, but after a moment, her face softened with the kind of expression that comes when a parent gets to share memories of a beloved child. "He was funny," she said, a small smile breaking through her sadness, always making jokes, even in his letters from overseas. He said laughter was the only thing that kept him sane over there. She paused, lost in memory. "He loved music too. He played guitar, wrote songs. Nothing professional like you, but he had dreams." Marcus felt another piece of his defensive wall crumble. David Williams hadn't been a symbol or a statistic. He had been a young man with dreams, with talent, with a future that had been cut short, just like the unknown soldiers beneath the tomb. He had been someone's son, someone's hope for the future. "What kind of songs did he write?" Marcus asked. "Country mostly. He said it was the only music that told the truth about real life." Mrs. Williams's smile grew wider, He used to joke that if he ever made it big, he was going to write a song about standing guard duty. He said there was something beautiful about watching over people even if they couldn't watch back. The words hit Marcus like a revelation. David Williams had understood something about service that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. The guard's vigil wasn't about the dead being able to appreciate it. It was about the living finding meaning in the act of caring, in the promise to remember. Other veterans and family members had gathered around their conversation, drawn by something they sensed happening. Marcus looked at their faces and saw stories written in wrinkles and scars, in proud postures and quiet grief. Each person carried connections to this place that ran deeper than tourism or patriotic duty. "I wish I could have met him," Marcus said to Mrs. Williams, and he meant it. "Your son sounds like someone who understood things that I'm just learning." "He would have liked you," she replied, surprising him. "Despite everything, I think he would have appreciated that you're willing to learn. He always said the worst thing wasn't making mistakes. It was being too proud to admit them." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, a rare occurrence for someone who had trained himself to maintain control in public situations. But this wasn't about public image anymore. This was about understanding what real honor looked like, what genuine service meant. The guard continued his steady pace. 21 steps, pause, turn, 21 steps back. Marcus found himself counting along again, but this time the rhythm felt like a heartbeat, like the pulse of something alive and meaningful. The repetition wasn't boring. It was reassuring, a constant in a world full of change and loss. "There's something I'd like to do," Marcus said suddenly, looking around at the gathered faces. "If it would be appropriate, if you think it would honor David and all the others." Mrs. Williams studied his face carefully. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would either help heal the wound he had opened or make it infinitely worse. But something inside him knew that this moment required more than words, more than apologies. It required him to offer the one thing he did best, the gift that had made him famous in service of something greater than himself. "I'd like to sing," he said simply. "Not for publicity, not for cameras, just to honor your son and all the others who can't come home. If you think that would be okay." The request hung in the air, surprising everyone, including Rebecca, who looked like she might faint. Marcus singing here now after what had just happened could either be the most meaningful gesture of his career or the most spectacular public relations disaster in entertainment history. Mrs. Williams looked at Marcus for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any trace of the arrogance that had marked his earlier behavior. The other veterans and family members around them waited in tense silence, uncertain whether this famous singer's offer was genuine respect or another form of self-serving performance. "What would you sing?" she asked finally, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus had been asking himself the same question. None of his hit songs seemed appropriate for this moment. His chart toppers were about love and heartbreak, about fame and success, about experiences that suddenly felt trivial compared to the weight of sacrifice that surrounded him here. "Something I've never sung before," he said quietly. "Something that feels right for this place, for David, for all of them." The military mother nodded slowly. David would want that. He always believed music could heal things that words couldn't touch. Rebecca stepped closer to Marcus, her face pale with worry. "Marcus, are you sure about this?" "Without any preparation, without—" "I'm sure," Marcus interrupted gently. He looked around at the faces gathered near him, then at the guard who continued his methodical vigil. "This isn't about preparation. It's about respect." Word began to spread quietly through the cemetery that Marcus Cole was about to sing at the tomb of the unknown soldier. More visitors began to gather, some recognizing the famous singer, others drawn simply by the unusual scene developing near the memorial. The crowd grew larger, but the atmosphere remained hushed and expectant. Marcus walked closer to the memorial, positioning himself where his voice would carry, but where he wouldn't interfere with the guard's sacred duties. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about his grandfather, about David Williams, about all the young men and women who had given their lives in service to something greater than themselves. When he opened his eyes, Marcus began to sing without any musical accompaniment, his voice rising clear and strong in the crisp autumn air. But instead of one of his famous songs, he sang Amazing Grace, the hymn that had comforted grieving families for generations. His voice, trained through years of professional performance, carried across the memorial grounds with a purity and power that seemed to transform the very air around them. The familiar melody, sung with such skill and evident emotion, reached into the hearts of everyone listening and found the places where their own grief and hope resided. Mrs. Williams closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she remembered her son's funeral, where this same hymn had been sung by a military chaplain. But Marcus's version seemed to carry not just the sorrow of loss but the promise of reunion, the hope that sacrifice had meaning beyond the grave. The guard continued his measured steps, but something in his posture suggested that he too was moved by the music. His pace remained precise, but there was a subtle softening in his bearing, as if the song had reminded him of the humanity he protected through his vigil. As Marcus sang the second verse, his voice growing even stronger and more confident, the crowd around the memorial began to swell. Visitors from other parts of the cemetery were drawn by the sound, creating a gathering larger than any typical changing of the guard ceremony. But despite the growing numbers, the atmosphere remained reverent and focused. This wasn't a concert or a performance in any traditional sense. It was something rarer and more precious, a moment of genuine communion between the living and the memory of the dead, facilitated by music that transcended all the barriers of ego and misunderstanding that had existed just minutes before. Veterans in the crowd stood at attention, their hands moving automatically to their hearts or to salute position. Family members of fallen soldiers held each other, finding comfort in the shared recognition of their loss and the beauty of this unexpected tribute. When Marcus reached the final verse, his voice seemed to gather even more power, filling not just the immediate area around the tomb but carrying across the entire cemetery. The words "was blind but now I see" took on special meaning in this context, reflecting not just spiritual awakening but Marcus's own journey from ignorance to understanding. As the last notes faded into silence, the entire crowd remained motionless. Even the sounds of distant traffic seemed muted, as if the whole world had paused to honor what had just taken place. The guard completed his current circuit and paused in perfect stillness, the only movement the gentle flutter of the American flag in the autumn breeze. Marcus stood with his head bowed, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just experienced. This wasn't like any performance he had ever given. There had been no applause, no cheering, no rush of adrenaline from audience approval. Instead, there was something deeper and more lasting, the knowledge that his voice had served a purpose beyond entertainment, beyond personal glory. Mrs. Williams approached him slowly, her face still wet with tears but transformed by something approaching peace. "David heard that," she said simply. "Wherever he is now, he heard that, and he knows he's remembered." The crowd began to disperse gradually, many visitors stopping to speak quietly with Marcus, sharing their own stories of loss and service. Each conversation added another layer to his understanding of what this place represented and why his earlier words had been so hurtful. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the cemetery, Marcus realized that he had been fundamentally changed by this experience. The singer who had arrived here that morning, focused on image and schedule and personal success, felt like a different person entirely. The guard continued his eternal vigil, 21 steps each direction, as he would every hour until his shift ended and another soldier took his place. But now Marcus understood that this wasn't just duty or tradition. It was love made visible, promise made tangible, honor given form through faithful service. His voice had indeed silenced the crowd, but in doing so, it had also silenced something within himself, the part that had valued cleverness over compassion, performance over purpose. In its place was something new and fragile but genuine, the beginning of wisdom about what it truly meant to use his gifts in service of something greater than himself.